Committee for this bill. Thank you.
Split call, yes, Dr. Megan Woods.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
A point of order, David Cleaner.
Sorry to interrupt the member, but our second speaker this evening is actually unwell, won't be here, so we're quite happy for Labor to take the call.
Okay. If not, it's not a split call. The member may take a little more time.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm happy to take what was going to be a short call on this bill, on this Prisoners and Victims Claims Continuation and Reform Amendment Bill. My colleagues have traversed the reasons why Labor won't be supporting this bill and the history of this bill at some length. And indeed, many of my colleagues have been very involved in the history of this piece of legislation through the passage of this House and have a great deal of background to it. And the previous Labor Speaker before me, the Honourable Leanne Dalzell, pointed out very succinctly the reasons why it is that Labor is not supporting this piece of legislation. This is a piece of legislation that does not do what it set out to do. It is a disappointing piece of legislation and it doesn't achieve what it promised to do. It doesn't address those core needs of the victims that we as members of Parliament hear day after day from people and that we know exist. And we're disappointed that this is a piece of legislation that does not address those. Put simply for us, this legislation is simply not good enough. Now, we've heard a great deal about how this was a piece of legislation that was never intended to have the longevity that members opposite are attempting to give it, that it indeed had sunset clauses in it and sunset clauses that are being rolled over and over, and that this just isn't adequate. And what is more, we agreed to the last rollover of this legislation on the proviso that the government was going to come and consult with opposition members, that we could actually genuinely work together to try and get a piece of legislation that would address these very real needs and these very important needs in our society, in our communities. And again, we are disappointed. There's that word again. We're disappointed that government members didn't come and consult with opposition members. And yes, Maggie Barry, we are often disappointed by the government members opposite. We are very disappointed that they failed to deliver on what they are going to do, and it is a government of broken promises. Yes, we are very, very disappointed in that, Maggie Barry. And we are disappointed that this bill is not sufficiently victim-centric. We have an opportunity here and we are not taking it. We do have an opportunity to actually do something that addresses these rights. And we have an opposition that's standing there and they're talking a great deal about victims' rights. They're talking about the slogans that go around this, and they've got a great deal of empty rhetoric around this, because if this was a government that really cared about victims' rights, would it be a government that was prepared to let the burglary clearance rate languish at 25% with no movement in that figure? So 75% of burglaries remain unsolved. And if we actually think about the constituents we talk about, the everyday people that we talk with and their experience of crime in this country, often for me in my electorate office in Wigram, it's people coming in and talking about the devastation that a burglary has had on their life. That they're talking about the way in which they don't feel safe in their homes, and they're talking about the way that they don't feel safe in their communities anymore. If we really cared about, and if the government really cared about the rights of victims and was going to back up its rhetoric that we're hearing opposite with and not be a disappointment, that we might actually see some movement in that figure, that 25% just isn't good enough. 3/4 of people getting away with this most devastating of crimes is not good enough. And if this was a government that really cared about the rights of victims and really fundamentally addressing these, let's have a look at some of the other things it could do. So there's a 900 backlog of jury trial backlogs in the Auckland and Manukau courts. 900 is the backlog of and that's in the area that you live and represent, Arian Fenton. 900 people, that's 900 victims, that's 900 offenders, that's 900 witnesses, that's 900 communities waiting for over 2 years to get justice. This is not a way to deliver fair outcomes to anyone involved in crime, let alone the victims. This is again an example of a government that is not committed to a victim-centric justice system. What it is doing is putting up legislation that doesn't adequately meet its mark of what it needs to do. It is putting up legislation that isn't adequate for what it needs to achieve. Labor believes that the best solution is to stopping compensation payments to inmates is to ensure that breaches don't occur in the first place. There's many very unfair aspects of this legislation that my colleagues have traversed at length. For example, the fact that if you get your money while you were in jail and you've got a victim waiting, if you get your money through lotto or you get an inheritance from a family member or anyone leaves you some money in a will, that money then isn't there. And we haven't heard in any of this debate in the House a government member rise and tell us what is fair, what is just, and how this is doing adequate justice for victims and looking after their rights, the very thing that government members are purporting that this bill has done. And let's actually have a look at the reality of the situation. Since the enactment of the precursor piece of this legislation, its precursor, there's actually been a low number of claims, such as the one that triggered that original piece of legislation. If we actually look at the reality of the situation and what has been happening, and we haven't heard government members actually address what the scale of the problem is here, what it is they're seeking to address and what it is they're seeking to solve with this inadequate piece of legislation. The Labor Party minority review is that the legislation, in the legislation extending the sunset clause, made it clear that we only support the extension of the sunset clause to ensure that replacement legislation is required and once that can be developed. And we haven't seen that through the passage of time. The Select Committee, when it heard the original piece of legislation, received 5 submissions for the extension of the bill, and only one of those was in support of the bill. Submitters opposing the bill were primarily concerned about the human rights implications of the provisions in the original Act and Bill, and these are concerns that have not been adequately addressed. We don't have a government that seems to be adequately concerned about prisoners and victims' rights. We don't have a piece of legislation that is going to address a real need. We have a piece of legislation before us that does not do what it promised to do, and we have a piece of legislation that is a disappointment, and for this reason Labor will not be supporting this bill.
Jamie Lee Ross.
Mr Speaker, on this subject I'd like to start by reading out a quote in relation to this issue.